Jason Boyd is the other one. And I want to begin by acknowledging with gratitude that we are meeting today in the Dish with One Spoon territory. And the Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas, and the Haudenosaunee that bound them together to protect the land. And subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, immigrants, and newcomers of all kinds have been invited into this treaty with respect and friendship. So I'm grateful for that. I'm also grateful to introduce a longtime colleague and friend, Erin Tucker, who is a member of the research, as a research fellow of Center for Digital Humanities for many years. But he wears many hats. He's also a poet, a novelist, a published writer, a film scholar, and an artist. He's currently an LEA scholar at York University in the Cinema and Media Studies Department pursuing his doctorate. And he's going to be speaking, he has so many interesting digital projects, but this one is something that is really new to me, so I'm keen to hear it. It's on facial recognition software, and as we all know, that is a big issue right now, both personally and politically. And he's going to take us through some of the nearly invisible and largely unaudited and unregulated aspects of FRS, or facial recognition software. So he's now going to take us on the path to ethically sorted algorithms, and I hope you will.
Somewhere down the path, yeah.
Somewhere down the path, we'll see the destination in view by the end of this. He's going to talk for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have some time for discussion at the end, I hope. So please join me in welcoming Erin.
All right. Well, good afternoon. Thank you, Lorraine and Jason and Reg as well for always encouraging me as part of the Center for Digital Humanities. So I have been a fellow, I think, since 2014. I've been pretty relentlessly supported, and I'm very appreciative of that. I'm also a member of the Ryerson Collaboratory, which is down on the 3rd floor. It's meant to be a faculty space in which people are collaborating in many different kind of digital and physically mechanical projects. Also, Namir is here as well from the DME, which is a student-run kind of version of the collaboratory. Is that fair to say? Yeah, like a maker space and all sorts of different things as well, kind of student-centric. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, but I do think it's important to like promote the spaces at Ryerson where this research is being done, because I think it's quite important. I'm also at York. I'm a doctoral scholar at the Vision Science to Application Lab that's up there right now, and I'm also in the Cinema and Media Studies at York. So my research right now, I'm working on my comp, so it's a little bit broad, it's a little bit sprawling at this point, so there's going to be a lot of stuff I'm thinking through, but I'm not necessarily going to talk about today. If you want to talk about it in the Q&A, that would be something, including biopolitics, governmentality, facial recognition as tactic, as strategy, thinking through the ethical implications of the technology, in particular through this idea of critical posthumanism. I think it's kind of inevitable that I have to touch on surveillance studies, so eventually I'm going to talk a little bit more about it. If I'm being frank, it's the thing that I'm like least interested in, but we can talk about that as well. I also want to do some kind of archaeological digging into just the design of facial recognition software. What were the key developments in its history? What were the key questions that pushed the technology forward? And then kind of breaking apart its mechanics. So what did it look like in the 60s? What did it look like in the 70s? And so on. And then lastly, when I start talking about some of my research creation, this is to me kind of an underdeveloped field. A number of the facial recognition databases use celebrity headshots. There's a conception of the face that I think owes itself to cinema and celebrity that I think is an interesting thing to kind of pull out of the history of it. So I want to pursue that more. But today, the three things I want to talk about, these kind of three vectors of focus, in particular because I think this is a digital humanities context, so I want to talk a little bit about the humanities perspective of it. A media archaeology through 19th century photographic practices it leads us into a potential ontology of facial recognition software processed images and moving images. And then lastly, I wanted to talk about some of the projects I've been working on from a research creation or an artistic perspective. So part one, please forgive the font if it's a little bit small. I can post the notes later, but I'll probably read some of it to you anyway. Joy Bulan-Winnie, she's at the MIT Media Lab. She's been doing a lot of work over the last 4 years in particular, talking about what she calls this idea of the coded gaze. And she bases this in the idea that many apps and programs borrow from common code libraries to build their bedrock functions, and therefore the embedded consciousness and unconscious bias of the initial programmers, which are very often white males, are repeatedly perpetuated. So it's this idea that the code itself is imbued with these biases that then get perpetuated through its use. She is a co-author on this project called Gender Shades, which is really fantastic. She also works with the Algorithmic Justice League, which is worth looking at. But Gender Shades basically goes through a selection of facial recognition databases and then the software that's attached to it. And it's a really in-depth set of research that proves again and again that facial recognition software is optimized for white faces and struggles with almost every other kind of face in order to separate them. So it can't tell, for example, one dark-skinned face from another dark-skinned face very well. This becomes pretty troubling when we start looking at the Center on Privacy and Technology at Georgetown Law. They put out a lot of really good research in this respect. They put out a report called the Perpetual Lineup in 2016. It states that nearly 1 in every 2 US citizens are already in a database. So this happens through automatic enrollment in photo ID, in visa application, in passports, and any number sort of governmental applications of photo ID. You just automatically get enrolled in these databases. So these troublings then, if 1 in every 2 citizens is already in a database, and this was 3 years ago, made all the more urgent when we realize that facial recognition software, especially when it's used by law enforcement, which is one of its most common applications, is grossly unchecked, unregulated, and unaudited. One of the most damning conclusions they draw is that, quote, face recognition may be least accurate for those it's most likely to affect, African Americans. It's a really terrifying report. It's good to look at because I think it lays a lot of the groundwork for what's going on. Again, it's not just surveillance. It's not just tracking people in my mind. It is that. But it is also, like kind of low stake things like maybe social media filters, which are part of to my mind, a function creep that make facial recognition kind of more acceptable. It gets more and more integrated into our everyday life. This comes along with, for example, when you go to the Eaton Center and you stare into one of those like black monoliths, they are quite often, because something came out about Fairview Cadillac, where they use face recognition in those kiosks to do demographic targeting and have a look at it. Current Canadian policy is if you don't save that data, you can do whatever you like. So it's, again, creeping into these systems in these public places. We have, when we start moving into things like border control, the US currently is implementing something called the biometric air exit, where they want to take everyone's face that's leaving the country and use that as a marker of citizenship. And we can start to see how facial recognition software then becomes a sorting technology, not just a tracking technology, into citizen and not citizen, and then from there we can imagine applications. Tenant verification in low-income housing. I literally read an article this morning in Detroit where they're cutting trees away from some public housing so that the cameras have a better view of who is entering and exiting. This was in the New York Times today. So it is, again, being applied in a variety of ways to a variety of populations, not just to track, but to also sort. There's a number of job hiring and employment firms that will use facial recognition and facial metrics to determine the best job candidates, as examples. So the technology is not just being used to track people, it's being used in all of these different ways that I think are really important to kind of tease out. If you're interested in learning a little bit more, or maybe you're teaching a class kind of in this area, these 3 books are a good place to start, I think. Algorithms of Oppression, Weapons of Math Destruction, and Zuboff's The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. I thought I'd just include them because they've been kind of important to my thinking. I wanted to focus in particular on one book, Simone Brown's Dark Matters, on the surveillance of blackness. It's a fascinating book. Part of it is that she kind of takes the idea of the panopticon and moves it forward to talk about how the slave ship becomes a panoptic model for black bodies. And the whole chapter on it looks at kind of diagrams of slave ships and talks about how that particular apparatus is the apparatus that has continued throughout the history, targeting black bodies in particular. What I like to take from this particular book is this concept of a critical biometric consciousness that she's advocating for. So she says, key to this idea of a critical biometric consciousness is, quote, informed public debate around these technologies, so biometrics at large. I'm talking kind of more about facial recognition software, and their application and accountability by the state and private sector, where the ownership of and access to one's own body data must be understood as a right. So I wanted to take up this concept of a critical biometric consciousness and talk about the ways in which I would like my research to participate in that and to raise this sort of consciousness. So one of the ways that I wanted to talk about it was going back through some of its roots, like in what particular practices did some of these principles of facial recognition emerge from. So what I wanted to start with was looking at 19th century photographic practices around portraiture. And in particular, portraiture as it related to medical experiments, medical populations, and law enforcement in particular. Because I think a lot of the principles used for facial recognition, identification, verification there have been carried forward and embedded into the software. So one of the, I think, most useful articles on just this general topic about like the role of this photographic portraiture is Sekula's The Body in the Archive. So he argues that photography, as it was employed in the 19th century law enforcement, employed by 19th century law enforcement in particular, generated a double system, a system of representation capable of both functioning honorifically and repressively. So it would promote certain types of populations and reduce certain types of population. Photographic portraiture both created notions of superiority and inferiority becoming weaponized, with every portrait implicitly taking its place within a social and moral hierarchy. So this is an example of Francis Galton's work, who I'm going to talk about a little bit later, proponent of eugenics, but he used a lot of photographic kind of taxonomies of the face in particular to talk about, let's say, the faces that are most likely to get ill, or the faces that are most likely to be criminal. And he was using this idea of faces, and in particular composite photography, which I'll talk about a little bit later, as a way to identify, sort, and promote certain faces as having superior or inferior qualities. And he used photographs as like one of the key pieces of evidence in his like quote unquote scientific practice. So for Sekula, he explains that this understanding of the photographic portrait here led to a code of quote visual interpretation of the body's signs, specifically signs of the head, and a technique of mechanized visual representations. This unified system of representation and interpretation promised a vast taxonomical ordering of images of the body. Into the 20th century, he contends the lingering prestige of optical empiricism was sufficiently strong to ensure that the terrain of the photographable was still regarded as roughly congruent with that of knowledge. So this idea, if you could take a photo, it was a piece of objective evidence. Here is, I'll do another slide on this later, but this is a table of signaletics by Alphonse Breton, created. Basically, he would do catalogs of criminals, and he would take all of their ears and all of their eyes and all of their mouths, and he would break them down and talk about how these were in fact kind of criminal traits. And again, the implication in almost all of this is if you possess these traits, you were likely to be a criminal, you were likely to be inferior. And if you didn't, you were obviously superior. All of these scholars, I think it's probably pretty obvious, are white men, and they are upholding sort of like white facial features, for lack of a better word. So in particular, I wanted to talk about mechanized visual representation. So for me, there's a couple components to this. It's that the photograph mechanized and made reproducible portraits of the face, and then the portraits of the face were like kind of chopped up and datified. So these practices started emerging in the 19th century. I wanted to start with Duchenne's experiences in 1862. Mechanism of human facial expression. So he would apply electrodes to people's faces and stimulate them as a way of generating facial expressions, and then he would take photos of them. So he'd say like shock, and he'd electrically stimulate their face as a way of producing certain types of faces. For me, this is important initial work because it involves kind of this mix of technology and science with the face as a primary site, and then we get photographs deployed as kind of taxonomical evidence. So I think this is a really interesting kind of beginning point. Charles Darwin, he loved Duchenne's work. So much, in fact, that he included it in the expressions of emotion in man and animals. So as a text, he wanted to see like whether emotions were common across all people around the world. And so he was working through this problem of the face and facial expressions. So you can see here, this is kind of a drawing of Duchenne's photograph. There's a number of Duchenne's pieces of work in this text. We probably, when we think of Darwin, we think of evolution, the theory of evolution. That's kind of one of the other undercurrents in this, is that evolution starts to, again, be applied in the function of separating inferior and superior classes of people and inferior and superior types of faces and facial characteristics. So Darwin's kind of theory of evolution started to be perverted into things like eugenics. So you have Francis Galton, kind of one of the more celebrated scientists of the 19th century. There's a lot written on him, and a lot of it is laudatory. But he comes up with this idea of eugenics, this idea that certain species have evolved to be more superior than others. He would use this idea of composite photography. You can see, if you look closely at this, kind of ghostly features, like you have a face and then you have kind of faces around it. So composite photography, he would lay multiple photographs of a type of face on top of each other as a way of trying to create a composite face or a representative face for the value he was looking at. These are quote unquote like the Jewish type of face. So he would take multiple people who identified as Jewish and make these sort of like conglomerates of photographs. So for me, again, Galton's work is important because, again, it's in this moralistic value system of separating superior and inferior faces, but it's also a scientific set of experiments aimed at reproducing certain types of faces, labeling them, and then using them to predict certain characteristics. So we have Galton, and if we pair it with Breton and his idea of signaletics, anthropomorphical identification, you can see on the far right there his sort of system in which he would literally divide up the face into its component parts, and then he would kind of create these taxonomies. So he eventually invents the fingerprint as a method, taking your fingerprint as identification, verification. He creates a system for mugshots. He creates a system by which a crime occurs in a room and you can measure everything in the room. So his big contribution was not just taking faces, but kind of measuring faces in a really scientific way and kind of chopping them up and datifying them. So for me, this principle that the face is a site of identification of certain qualities in his work gets tethered to verification and identification. So it's not just enough to like evaluate the face, you now have to link it to a type of identity. And maybe that's a state identity, maybe that's an identity that's constructed in prisons, as it was in Kilmainham in Dublin. So there's this move at the end of the 19th century into the 20th century, not just to evaluate faces, but to tether that evaluation to specific kind of government-enabled systems of identification and verification. So this ends up taking place in a number of different texts. Again, I'm not going to go into them in detail, but if people are interested in learning more, this is something I want to... This is basically a chapter, I think, of my dissertation, which I take up each of these texts a little bit more. You get Lombroso's criminal avatism, basically arguing that, coming out of evolution, that African people in particular are closer to apes than white people, right? They haven't evolved as much. And he also loved like dividing up faces. There's tables in his work of like minute measurements of ears and lips and all sorts of things. And then we also have the last three here are just a collection of kind of photographic portraits of criminals, proto mugshots, that sort of thing. I was in Dublin this summer. I got to tour Kilmainham. They were one of the earlier systems of photographing prisoners as a way of identifying and keeping track of them. So if they're arrested here and they got arrested again, you kind of compare these two things. Kilmainham's also interesting because it frames this system as a distinctly colonial technology. It's imported by the British as a way of kind of monitoring and repressing a population. So I think that's important too. This is an example actually from the 1960s, the sorts of photographs that would be on hand at the Kilmainham prison. So again, there's this practice that emerges from 19th century photography of mechanically reproducing the face, kind of putting them in a database, datifying the faces, and then translating the face into identity and verification. Almost all of it comes out of law enforcement and comes out of kind of this idea of criminality, predicting criminality, identifying criminality. So when we jump forward, Agombin's relatively short essay, No to Biopolitical Tattooing, I think provides a really useful bridge for me from these practices, because he talks about all of the people I just talked about in his own writing, and he says, okay, well, what does that mean in 2019? So in this essay 11 years ago, and I would argue, it's only gotten more urgent, he relays that thus, by applying these techniques and these devices invented for the dangerous classes to a citizen, or rather to a human being as such states, which should constitute the precise space of political life, have made the person the ideal suspect, to the point that it's humanity itself that has become the dangerous class. So it's this idea that when you start to apply these technologies broadly to every citizen everywhere, they are treated as criminal first, and they must work their way back to proving almost their own innocence. It's an interesting sort of thought. There's more work for me in Agombin talking about bare life, citizenship, in particular facial recognition at the border and separating citizen from non-citizen, that I think is kind of urgent in this moment. So I'm going to skip over a little bit, but I thought I would at least gesture to some of my thoughts that are bridging. How do we get from, say, these 19th century photographic practices into, let's say, post-World War II or our contemporary moment? For me, there's more thoughts to be done on like Fordism, the idea of the body being treated algorithmically. What does that mean? There's more to be said about IBM's direct collaboration with Nazi Germany. There's a lot of scholarship on that. That, for me, is important because it is a corporation basically building an infrastructure, computerized infrastructure, to repress, sort and repress a large population of people. That a lot of their mechanics and tactics are not that different than some of the applications of facial recognition software. Alongside this, especially post-World War II, you have development of the digital computer and artificial intelligence, and you have the development of computer science and computer vision. And for me, this is one of the bridges that gets me into this contemporary moment. So in the 19th and 20th century, I think one of the central issues is that eugenics, for example, was treated as a science. And it was therefore ontologized as a science, and it bore all the markers of evidence and legitimacy and objectivity. For me, in this current moment, a lot of facial recognition software is ontologized as a computer science. And when it's ontologized as a computer science, it asks entirely different questions. Most of them are based around accuracy and speed. So how quickly can this system identify this face as this person? And all other kind of questions fall by the wayside. When you ontologize something as a science experiment, you care about the scientific results, not necessarily all parts of the methodology. So it's one of the things that I want to use to get into the next section here. And that certain bodies then, through this ontologizing and the inherent biases Boulin-Winnie talks about in terms of like the coded gaze, they become more likely to be labeled criminal or a threat, and that these biases are built into the subconsciousness of the code or the architecture. So I wanted to look a little bit more at the architecture of facial recognition specifically, like how does it work in a really basic way. This is, again, part of my own idea of raising critical biometric consciousness, is just opening up some of the black boxes of this technology and just say, how do we get from a camera looking to identifying a person? So some of this comes out of an essay that's going to be published probably next year, I hope. Meta-watching in an ontology of facial recognition cinema. It won this year's FSAC Student Essay Prize, which was exciting for me. The basic conceit, I don't really want to read this to you, is that facial recognition software involves kind of two distinct acts of watching. And it is those two distinct separate acts of watching, when they're combined, that allow for some of these really problematic uses. So, for example, I've been building some of these diagrams. So I want to talk first about just really, really simple facial recognition software. So simple facial recognition software is essentially object recognition. Is there a face, right? So find a face in this photo. If there's no face, do something, right? It has nothing to do with identification, verification, whose face is this. It's just simply, can I recognize a face in a photo? So how do we get from, let's say there's a CCTV camera in the corner, how do we get from that camera to this idea of, okay, I can see the face in this moving image? So we start as sort of live action, and then the camera watches that live action. So for me, that's the first act of watching, right? And there's been tons of theorizing on that in the last 100 years. Some of it's cinema studies, some of it's out of philosophy. There's a certain, body of knowledge that comes out of what happens to us when we're watched by a camera and what sort of image is created by that. What's interesting for facial recognition is it takes that and then processes it through this series of different bits of hardware. So this is, keep in mind, this is kind of like the simplest version of object recognition. So the camera watches some live action. The first thing it does is actually take the video and chop it up into still images, so it becomes photographs. And it takes the individual still image from each photograph and it passes it through some sort of object recognition little bit of code. The one that I've been using is called a HAR cascade. So it's an XML file that's been pre-written by some computer scientists. There's a great YouTube video that goes through it here. This diagram here on the left is sort of a visualization of how a HAR cascade goes through. Basically, it has a number of values that it knows to be in a face, and it kind of tries to match those values in these sort of binary ways to the photo you give it. So it literally kind of like moves over the photo and tries to match what it knows to be a face to the photograph itself. So this is a pre-written set of software that you can just download off the internet and plug into this apparatus. For me, this is where, for the HAR cascade, we should be asking questions about like who designed this, what sort of faces generated this HAR cascade. Like that's part of the place where we can start to maybe pull out some of the biases. So again, the HAR cascade, it just answers a simple question: is there a face in this or not? If there's not, maybe we just pass the image back, right? And we just say there's no face here, here's the original image. If it does recognize a face, a positive, then we can do something to it. We can add a bounding box. So a bounding box is sort of what we probably most often see as representation of facial recognition. So on your social media filters, your cameras, draw a box around the face, and then we pass it back. So once we do this, can I, as an object, recognize the face? Then we can start to do all sorts of other things with the face. And you'll notice they don't look that different than some of the 19th century photographic practices. So this particular one comes from iBug, which I think was done by, I don't know exactly. I think it's Maryland, but don't hold me to that. They combined this sort of object recognition of the face with facial landmarks. So they said, okay, now that we can find a face, let's find your eyes, your eyebrows, and that sort of thing. So they built this numeric system that actually allows you to target certain parts of the face within it. What's interesting again about the iBug database is almost all of it is built from celebrity headshots. Like that was their testing data, which I find kind of fascinating. So that photo of Elvis actually comes out of their database. This was one of the things they were using for their training. You can start to see different sort of things that we can do to a face, therefore, once we start landmarking the facial features themselves, right? Part of the reason I wanted to draw attention to this is, again, it's a datifying of the face that to my mind is almost a direct evolution of some of the photographic practices I talked about earlier. Because once you start doing this and you start identifying the very specific facial characteristics in a face, then we can start moving into this idea of identification and verification. So for me, this is the more complex version of a facial recognition software. Is this a face? Okay, so that's object recognition. And the second part is, if it is a face, whose face is it? So you can imagine this diagram here. I would need like 3 other diagrams, I think, to be able to do this, because it very quickly becomes a pretty sprawling project, because it requires artificial intelligence and machine training. So what you actually have to do before you deploy a system like this is you need to train it to look at a face and identify it specifically with another person or version of that face. So you need to actually train it. And built into that training is further data sets, code libraries, code components. So basically, when you imbue a system like this with artificial intelligence via machine learning, you end up having to involve all these other apparati of faces, basically. So this is sort of where I'm interested in poking in, at least at this point, is like when we are training these facial recognition software, what are we training them with? Because I think a lot of the scholarship on this right now and a lot of thinking on it is sort of the very, very end of like data privacy, data sovereignty. Are they tracking me, right? And I think that's valid to take up, obviously. But I think there is a lot of value to go back to like the very beginning and say, how are we training these systems? So I've just been collecting up like a lot of common facial databases and just going through and seeing like what's in them. So one of the more common ones from the National Institute of Science and Technology, American, is mugshots. So they have multiple mugshot databases that they use for facial recognition software training. And again, that kind of links us back into some of these 19th century photographic processes. So often if you are training a system on mugshots to look at other mugshots, we can think about all the biases, one, of like who's in that data set, i.e. who is most likely to be arrested. Remembering that a mugshot is not necessarily a conviction. A mugshot is that you are booked for a crime, you are not convicted of a crime. So who is most likely to be included in these systems, and then in what ways are we perpetuating them by using this software in this way? So in particular, I've been looking at the MEDS database. So there's actually 2 of them. There's the mugshot identification database. There's the ORL database, which is comprised entirely of mugshots. So I've been looking at these databases. I've also been looking at, again, the automatic enrollment of driver's license, passports, visas. Some of you might have heard of IBM's Diversity in Faces, perhaps? No? Okay. So it is a 1 million face data set that IBM put out earlier this year. And I think with good intentions on the surface. They said, and in fact, I think they worked specifically with Joy Boo and Winnie. They said, okay, our databases are not diverse enough. We're going to make a very diverse data set. And they did. They made like a million face data set that's actually pretty impressive. The problem is that they just went to Flickr and grabbed every face they could find. So it becomes this kind of like non-consensual gathering of data, again, in service of a scientific problem. That kind of, again, is ignoring some of the more, I think, humanities concerns that are happening in some of these places. So they did release, so I downloaded the first version. I was like, oh, this is interesting. They sent me an email 3 weeks later, and they're like, please delete that database. Here's a new database. That was ideally more consensual. Part of the problem with it is nobody knew if they were in the database or not. You had to download the database in order to know if you were in the database. And then you had to sort through the million faces to see if you were in it. And then you could opt out if you found yourself. Which, again, is kind of this like very strange, Borges-esque, Kafkaesque thing. So, thinking about these training sets, these databases, and just data in general, I wanted to end by talking about, alongside my scholarship, some of the research creation projects that this is manifested in. So building the basic facial recognition software, I worked with Nabila Abraham at the collaboratory, and we just worked together to build the basic object recognition. Can I find a face? And then, unfortunately, she's not at the collaboratory anymore, but that's okay. I'm working with Jay now, which is good too. We built like a suite of tools. So I just wanted to kind of say, like, if I found a face, I want to be able to pixelate it. If I found a face, I want to be able to mark the landmarks. I want to be able to blur it. I want to be able to do all these different things with it. So I was just trying to build up different things that I could do with this software. And Nabila was really great about it. We also built basically a version that could look at video and do the same thing. So having these tools was quite useful. The CDH sent me to DHSI. I was lucky enough to go. I think I've got to go a number of years, so I very much appreciate it. Where I took the Surveillance and Digital Humanities course, and I met Sol there. She's working in Italy right now. I think she's in the midst of applying for a PhD. She's a very, very incredible thinker, pretty amazing, evolutionary biologist by training, public art installations, exhibitions. We in kind of 2 or 3 days, put together the start of this project that we're calling the Facial Agency Project. So this is a project aimed at really, really quickly creating visualizations that separate how much data we want over our faces versus how much we actually likely have. So in a very basic way, you can see these are kind of done by the dual portrait. The portrait on the left is how much agency we want, and the portrait on the right is how much agency do we likely have. You can see, I know it's kind of small. We're building a website right now that'll free this up. This is a very simple calculation of how much do I want. How much do I actually have is this like incredibly complex calculation that involves things like biometric data, past usage and sharing of it, border crossings, citizenship. So certain citizens are more likely to have biometric technology applied to them. Certain races are more likely to have these technologies applied to them. So we kind of came up with this big, gigantic formula that you can sort of see here. And by doing that, generally what we found, with a few exceptions, is there's a pretty large gap between how much control I want, how obscured I want my face to be, and how obscured it actually is. And you can see it changes for different faces, basically. Nearly everyone wants the same agency, but different faces kind of give up their agency by participating in this system. So we're in the midst of creating kind of an app where you can upload your photo. It's deleted afterwards. Upload your photo and kind of do this and get this dual portrait. This led me to this idea of what I've been calling ethically sourced algorithms. So this idea, if we think about like ethically sourced food, where does our food come from? Thinking about the ingredients of algorithms and thinking about where do our ingredients of our algorithms come from, and tracing them back. Thinking about, okay, what are the common data sets or scripts or distribution platforms that are used in the construction and proliferation of these algorithms. If people want to get this, I've been working with Mike Ridley at the Collaboratory, kind of building. Ideally, I would like this to be something we could give anyone who wanted to come work in a lab. It's just a series of questions about their data use. If you're doing machine learning, here are some questions that are worth thinking about in terms of like, are we building something that is as ethically sourced or ethically responsible as possible? So this could be something that you might give to a class. This might be something you circulate in a lab. It's a work in progress. I do have a few copies if people want to come up and have a look at it. Or I guess I could just pass them around, and if people want to take one, they can just take and have a look at it. So again, if this is kind of in service of raising a critical biometric consciousness, it's this idea that we need to be, those of us that are in a position to create and educate are also promoting this idea of reflection and critical data construction and data use. Part of this then has been, how do I visualize what's in these data sets? So when I look at something like meds, because a lot of them, even just by downloading them, there are very strict things that say like, thou shalt not take more than 2 images out of this. Thou shalt not reproduce this data set in certain ways. So how do you talk about these data sets and what's in them and give examples of them without breaking their rules, whatever that is? So what I've started to do is this project called This Is Not a Criminal. So working with Kieran, he's a recent graduate. He works at the DME, which is also on the 3rd floor, specialization in deep learning, currently involved in GAN research. So that's me, that's us. Basically what we've done is we've taken, actually no, this is a better slide. We've taken the meds database, so it's about 1,200 photos, mugshots, right? And we've tried to create a neural network that can generate faces based on that original data set of what it thinks is exemplary of what's in the data set. So this is called, well, we're using a machine learning technique called GAN, but it basically a generative adversarial network in which you have a generator, something that makes a face, and then a discriminator that says, is this a face or not? And they kind of teach each other. You have 2 machine learning networks that are teaching each other. So here, we wanted to say, if we give it the meds database as its starting point, what kind of faces is it most likely to create? So we're having success. This is actually like a week ago, and we've made some pretty large, I would say like advances in this. Basically, it's in response to, maybe people have seen this, that top photo there is not a person. That is a generated face. It's a synthetic face. So it comes out of this project, this person does not exist. So basically what they did is the same thing we're doing, just with a much larger database and a much different database. So it's this idea that you can train a network to generate synthetic faces, fake faces. So for me, a project like this is akin to some of the data visualization projects that come out of digital humanities. This is visualizing the most likely face of that data set in an interesting way. What you'll notice, what it's end up creating is like a blackmail face generator. And I think that there is something in the rhetoric of that that's actually really important to critique the data set itself and the types of data sets that are then used in the middle of these technologies. So Kieran has been instrumental. He does the bulk of the coding. I kind of sit with him as a way of understanding, and then, I help very, very minutely around the edges of it. So it's kind of this combination of me learning this pretty complicated, I would say like computer science, and applying it as digital humanities does, to humanities concerns, to make sort of arguments that I think humanists are good at making. Yeah, and maybe actually before we wrap up, I would just say visually, this looks actually a lot like Galton's composite photography. Like you get these kind of like ghosted faces and different things that are kind of acting and reacting together, multiple faces on top of each other and that sort of thing. Yeah, so I think that's it for me. That's like a good 40 minutes, so I think that's good for me. Thank you very much.